The morning sun cast long shadows across Wilson Street as officers Mike Danvers and Steve Reynolds pulled their patrol car into their usual spot outside Joe's Diner. Every shop owner on the street watched them through their windows, and some quickly turned away when the officers looked in their direction. This had been their morning routine for the past 8 years, and everyone knew what was coming next. Mike Danvers, a tall man with graying hair and cold blue eyes, stepped out first. At 45, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew no one would dare challenge him. His partner, Steve Reynolds, younger at 38 but equally intimidating with his muscular build and permanent scowl, followed close behind. "Good morning, officers," Joe Martinez, the diner owner, called out nervously as they entered. His hands shook slightly as he poured their coffee, black for Danvers, 2 sugars for Reynolds. The same order, every morning, free of charge. The coffee wasn't what they were really there for. "Monthly insurance payment, Joe," Danvers said casually, while Reynolds stood by the door, arms crossed. "You know how dangerous this neighborhood can be. Would be a shame if something happened to this nice place of yours." Joe disappeared into the back and returned with an envelope. His face showed the strain of someone who had been doing this for too long but saw no way out. "It's all there, officers. 300, just like always." Reynolds counted the money while Danvers enjoyed his coffee. The other customers kept their heads down, suddenly very interested in their breakfast plates. Everyone knew, but no one dared speak up. Later that morning, they cruised through their territory, 6 blocks that they had turned into their personal kingdom. The local drug dealers operated freely, as long as they paid their weekly tax. Small business owners like Joe contributed their insurance payments. Even the other cops stayed away, knowing this was Danvers and Reynolds' turf. At the corner of Pine and Fifth, they spotted Tommy Miller, one of their regular dealers, talking to someone they didn't recognize. Reynolds hit the sirens for just a second, and Tommy immediately walked over to their car. "New guy giving you trouble, Tommy?" Danvers asked, his voice carrying a threat that wasn't even trying to hide itself. "No, sir, Officer Danvers. Just a lost tourist asking for directions," Tommy replied quickly, slipping an envelope through the car window. "This week's contribution to the Police Athletic League, as always." Both officers smiled at their little joke. The Police Athletic League envelope was their standard cover. They even given Tommy a stack of the envelopes to make it look official. The money inside had nothing to do with youth sports and everything to do with letting Tommy keep his corner. By afternoon, they had collected from 3 more businesses and warned off 2 dealers who hadn't paid their dues. At the precinct, no one questioned why they brought in so few arrests or why certain areas under their watch seemed to have both high crime rates and low complaint rates. Their sergeant, Bill Morris, accepted the gift cards they regularly left on his desk and made sure their paperwork always looked clean. The day took an interesting turn when they spotted a new convenience store on their route. "Asian Market," read the sign, with "Grand Opening" written in bright letters across the window. Inside, an elderly Korean man was stocking shelves while a younger woman worked the register. "Looks like we need to welcome our new neighbors to the community," Reynolds said with a smirk, adjusting his badge. The bell chimed as they entered the store. The old man looked up and bowed slightly, while the young woman, probably his daughter, watched them cautiously. "Welcome to our store, officers," the old man said with a heavy accent. "How can I help you today?" Danvers leaned against the counter, his badge prominently displayed. "Just doing our community outreach. This can be a dangerous neighborhood for new businesses. Lots of break-ins, vandalism. But we have a special community protection program. Very affordable. Keeps the bad elements away." The old man's smile faded as he understood what was really being said. His daughter stepped forward, her eyes showing a flash of defiance that made Reynolds straighten up. But before she could speak, her father placed a gentle hand on her arm. "We are very grateful for police protection," the old man said quietly. "How much is this program?" As they left the store with their first payment from the new business, Danvers and Reynolds felt untouchable. They had their rhythm down perfect, their territory under control, and not a single person brave enough to challenge their authority. Little did they know that their comfortable world of corruption was about to face its biggest threat, and their reign over the 43rd Precinct was counting down to its final days. Inspector Sarah Chen stood in front of the 43rd Precinct building early Monday morning, her new badge gleaming in the sunlight. At 35, She had already made a name for herself in internal affairs, known for her sharp mind and even sharper instincts. Her long black hair was tied back neatly, and her pressed suit showed she meant business. The officers inside the building watched with curiosity as she walked through the doors. Some whispered among themselves. News of her arrival from internal affairs had spread quickly. A few older officers frowned, while others pretended not to notice her. Nobody liked having internal affairs around, especially not in their own precinct. Captain James Rodriguez was waiting in his office. "Inspector Chen, welcome to the 43rd, he said, standing to shake her hand. "Though I must say, I don't understand why Internal Affairs thinks we need special attention. We run a tight ship here." Sarah smiled politely, but said nothing about the real reason for her transfer. 3 months ago, an anonymous letter had reached Internal Affairs headquarters, detailing corruption in the 43rd Precinct. The letter mentioned two names specifically: Officers Mike Danvers and Reynolds. "I'm here to observe and help improve procedures, Captain," she replied smoothly. Standard departmental review. Her new office was small but had a perfect view of the parking lot. Sarah watched as Danvers and Reynolds arrived in their patrol car, noting how other officers moved out of their way. Their confident walks and the way they ignored basic protocols caught her trained eye immediately. During the morning briefing, Sarah sat quietly in the back, observing. When Danvers and Reynolds entered late, nobody said a word, not even the sergeant. She noticed how they sat apart from others, how younger officers avoided eye contact with them. "Those are your problem children," a voice said quietly beside her after the meeting. A young officer named Rodriguez had stayed behind. "But you didn't hear it from me." Sarah spent the next few days establishing her routine. She reviewed old case files, focusing on reports filed by Danvers and Reynolds. The patterns were there: low arrest rates in their patrol area, but high numbers of resolved situations with no paperwork. Businesses in their sector rarely reported crimes, which was unusual for that neighborhood. One afternoon, she drove through their patrol area. Store owners seemed nervous when they saw her badge, until she explained she wasn't from the local precinct. Outside Joe's diner, she watched Danvers and Reynolds make their daily visit. The owner's hands shook as he served them coffee. "They come every day?" she asked the waitress later. "Every single day," the waitress whispered, looking around nervously. "But please, I didn't tell you anything. I need this job." Sarah added it to her growing list of notes. That evening, while most officers were leaving, she stayed late to make some calls. She contacted other precincts, gathering information about similar patterns, building her case carefully. As she worked, Officer Rodriguez appeared at her door again. "Inspector, there's something you should know," he said, closing the door behind him. "Last year, a rookie tried to report them. A week later, he resigned. Said his family had been threatened." Sarah nodded, adding this to her files. "Thank you, officer. I'll be discreet." The next morning, she arrived early to find her office door slightly open. Inside, nothing seemed touched, but she knew better. On her desk was a cup of coffee, a clear message that someone had been there. Later that day, she spotted Danvers and Reynolds watching her from their patrol car. Danvers smiled and waved, but his eyes were cold. They thought their little warning would scare her off. They didn't know Sarah Chen very well. Back in her office, Sarah pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote at the top, "Operation Clean House." Below it, she started mapping out everyone connected to Danvers and Reynolds: business owners, other officers, local criminals. Someone would talk eventually. Someone always did. As the sun set over the precinct, Sarah looked at the growing web of connections in her notebook. Danvers and Reynolds had spent years building their corrupt empire, thinking they were untouchable. But Sarah had taken down corrupt officers before, and she knew one important truth: no one was truly untouchable. "Game on, gentlemen," she whispered to herself, adding one final note to her growing file. The real work was about to begin. Marcus Torres stood behind the counter of his small electronics repair shop, his heart beating fast as he watched officers Danvers and Reynolds walk through his door. At 28, Marcus was younger than most business owners in the area, and he had invested his entire savings into this shop 6 months ago. "Nice little business you got here," Danvers said, picking up a repaired phone from the counter. "Would be a shame if something happened to all these expensive items." Marcus felt his hands get sway, but he remembered his father's words. Stand up to bullies, or they'll never stop. His phone was in his shirt pocket, already recording, something he had started doing after hearing stories from other shop owners. "I know why you're here," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And my answer is no, I won't pay for your fake protection." Reynolds' friendly smile disappeared. He moved closer to the counter, his hand resting on his police belt. "Listen, kid. Every business in this area understands how things work. You want to be different. Bad things happen to different people." "Are you threatening me, Officer Reynolds?" Marcus asked clearly, making sure his phone picked up every word. "Because that would be illegal, wouldn't it?" Danvers laughed, but his eyes were angry. "Nobody's threatening anybody. We're having a friendly conversation about community safety. Right, Steve?" "Right," Reynolds agreed, picking up an expensive laptop from the repair shelf. "Lots of break-ins lately. Windows get broken, stuff disappears. Sometimes security cameras stop working too." Marcus felt scared, but he stood his ground. "My cameras work fine. They're recording right now, actually. And I have backups that upload everything to the cloud instantly." This wasn't true. He only had his phone recording, but the lie worked. Both officers stepped back slightly, their confident smiles wavering for a moment. "You're making a big mistake, kid," Danvers said softly. "Think about it overnight. We'll be back tomorrow, and you better have a different attitude." After they left, Marcus's legs felt weak. He sat down, his hands shaking as he stopped the recording on his phone. He had captured everything. The threats, the intimidation, their names and badges clearly visible. That evening, while closing his shop, Marcus noticed a police car driving by slowly 3 times. He knew they were watching him, trying to scare him. Instead of going home, he drove to another precinct, far from Danvers and Reynolds' territory. At the other station, he met Officer Sarah Chen. She listened carefully as he played the recording, her face serious but her eyes showing the hint of satisfaction. "You're very brave, Mr. Torres," she said, copying the recording to her computer. "But also very much in danger now. We need to protect you." "I won't close my shop," Marcus said firmly. "That's what they want, to scare everyone into paying or leaving. I won't do either." Sarah nodded, respecting his courage. "Then we'll set up real security cameras tonight, and tomorrow, when they come back, they'll find more than just you waiting for them." Early the next morning, Sarah's team installed hidden cameras inside and outside Marcus's shop. They looked like regular security cameras, but these fed directly to internal affairs. 2 undercover officers were positioned nearby, pretending to be customers at the coffee shop across the street. At exactly 10 a.m., Danvers and Reynolds returned. They walked into Marcus's shop looking confident, expecting to find a scared young man ready to pay. Instead, they found Marcus standing tall behind his counter, Inspector Chen sitting quietly in the corner reading a newspaper, and 2 uniformed officers from Internal Affairs browsing the shop's phones. "Good morning, officers," Sarah said, lowering her newspaper. "I hear you had an interesting conversation with Mr. Torres yesterday. Would you like to continue it now? We're all very interested in hearing about your community safety program." The color drained from Danvers' face. Reynolds turned to leave, but another officer was already blocking the door. "This isn't what you think," Danvers started to say, but Sarah cut him off. "Oh, I think it's exactly what we think," she said, placing Marcus's phone on the counter and pressing play. Their own voices filled the shop, every threat crystal clear. For the first time in years, Officers Danvers and Reynolds felt something they had made others feel countless times before: fear. And this was just the beginning of their troubles. After the incident at Marcus's shop, Inspector Sarah Chen's investigation moved quickly. She sat in her office late one night, surrounded by files and evidence that painted a disturbing picture of corruption. Her computer screen showed bank records that didn't match a police officer's salary, not even close. "Look at this," she said to Officer Rodriguez, who had become her trusted helper. "Danvers deposited $5,000 cash every month for the past 3 years. Reynolds did the same, but with different banks." Rodriguez leaned closer to look at the screen. They were smart about it. Never used the same bank, kept the amounts just low enough to avoid attention. But they hadn't been smart enough. Sarah pulled out a map of their patrol area marked with red dots, each dot representing a business that had paid them protection money. Next to it was a list of drug dealers who operated freely in their territory. 28 businesses, each paying $300 monthly. 6 drug dealers paying $1,000 weekly, Sarah calculated. They were making more money than the police chief. The evidence kept growing. After Marcus Torres's story got out, other people started coming forward. Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Mrs. Kim from the Asian market brought in a notebook where she had recorded every payment. My daughter told me to keep records, she explained, her hands shaking but her voice strong. She said truth always wins in America. Joe from the diner shared years of security camera footage. I saved everything, he said. Never thought anyone would be brave enough to stand up to them. Even some fellow police officers started talking. Young Officer Wilson admitted he had seen Danvers and Reynolds take money from drug dealers. They said they'd hurt my family if I told anyone, he explained, looking ashamed. I was too scared to stop them. But the biggest break came from an unexpected source. Tommy Miller, the drug dealer from their territory, had been arrested by another precinct. Facing serious charges, he decided to talk. They controlled everything, Tommy told Sarah in the interrogation room. They chose which dealers could work where. They decided the prices. They even helped get rid of competition by arresting dealers who wouldn't pay them. Sarah recorded everything. Each statement, each piece of evidence added another link in the chain she was building around Danvers and Reynolds. One morning, she received an urgent call from the evidence room manager. "Inspector, you need to see this," he said nervously. In the evidence room, he showed her several boxes of seized drugs that had been labeled as destroyed. But look, he pointed to the seals. They've been opened and resealed, and the weights don't match the records. Sarah had examined the boxes carefully. They were stealing seized drugs and selling them back to dealers, she realized. This was bigger than simple bribes and protection money. That afternoon, she called a meeting with Captain Rodriguez and representatives from the FBI. The evidence filled the entire conference table: bank records, witness statements, photos, videos, and Marcus's original recording. This goes beyond corrupt cops taking bribes, Sarah explained. They created an entire criminal organization using their police badges as cover. The FBI agents looked through the evidence, nodding grimly. "We'll take it from here," Inspector, one said. "This is now a federal case." Meanwhile, Danvers and Reynolds could feel their world shrinking. Their usual spots no longer welcomed them. Store owners looked them in the eye instead of looking away. Other officers kept their distance. "We need to do something," Reynolds said nervously as they sat in their patrol car. "Maybe we should leave town for a while." "No," Danvers replied firmly. "That would make us look guilty. We just need to get rid of some evidence. Tonight." They didn't know that Sarah had anticipated this. Hidden cameras were already installed in the evidence room. Officers were stationed nearby, waiting. The trap was set. As the sun set over the precinct, Sarah looked at the final piece of paper on her desk: arrest warrants for both officers. Tomorrow would change everything. "The bigger they are, the harder they fall," she said to herself, turning off her office light. Years of corruption were about to come crashing down, and Danvers and Reynolds had no idea they were spending their last night as free men. The clock struck midnight at the 43rd Precinct. The building was mostly empty, except for a few night shift officers and the cleaning staff. In the parking lot, Danvers and Reynolds sat in their personal car, watching the building's entrance. "The evidence room guard changes shift at 12:30, Danvers whispered, checking his watch for the third time. "Johnson's on duty tonight. He owes me a favor. He'll look the other way." What they didn't know was that Johnson had already talked to Inspector Chen. The favor Danvers mentioned was actually blackmail about Johnson's brother's old drug charges. Sarah had promised to help his brother instead of using threats, and Johnson had chosen to do the right thing. "Remember the plan," Reynolds said, nervously playing with his keys. "We go in, remove the drug evidence from last month's raids, and replace it with fake packages. Then we destroy Marcus's recording and any files Chen has in her office." Inside the building, Sarah sat in complete darkness in her office, watching through the security cameras she had installed just that morning. 6 FBI agents were hidden throughout the building, and more waited outside. Every corner of the evidence room was under surveillance. At exactly 12:30 a.m., Danvers and Reynolds entered the building. They nodded to Johnson at the front desk, who kept his eyes on his computer screen, pretending not to see them. Their footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as they headed toward the evidence room. Too easy, Danvers smiled, using his key to open the evidence room door. They had done this many times before, but tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier, tenser. As they began opening evidence boxes, Reynolds kept watching the door. "Hurry up," he whispered. "Something doesn't feel right." They found the box they were looking for, labeled case #4587, drug seizure. Danvers opened it and started removing packages of evidence, replacing them with similar-looking bags filled with sugar. Suddenly, the lights flashed on. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, her badge gleaming. "Good evening, officers," she said calmly. "Working late?" Danvers dropped the evidence bag. Reynolds reached for his gun, but stopped when he heard multiple weapons being drawn. FBI agents emerged from their hiding spots, guns pointed at both officers. "Don't even think about it," Sarah warned. "You're surrounded." "This isn't what it looks like," Danvers started to say, but Sarah cut him off. "Oh, really?" she asked, pointing to the ceiling. "So these cameras aren't recording you tampering with evidence right now? And I suppose that's not a bag of real drugs in your hand." Reynolds tried to run, but two FBI agents caught him before he reached the door. Danvers stood still, his face red with anger and humiliation. "You think you're so smart," he spat at Sarah. "You don't understand how things work in the real world. We kept order in this neighborhood." "No," Sarah replied firmly. "You terrorized innocent people. You betrayed your badge. And now you're going to pay for it." As the FBI agents read them their rights and put handcuffs on their wrists, both officers finally realized how far they had fallen. The same hallways they had walked through like kings, they now walked through as criminals. Outside, news vans were already arriving. Someone had tipped off the media. Store owners from the neighborhood stood across the street, watching as Danvers and Reynolds were led out in handcuffs. Marcus Torres was among them, filming everything on his phone. "Officers Michael Danvers and Steve Reynolds, you are under arrest," the FBI agent announced formally. "The charges include corruption, extortion, drug trafficking, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and abuse of power." Sarah watched as they were placed in separate FBI vehicles. The same men who had seemed so powerful just days ago now looked small and defeated. Their badges were removed, their guns confiscated, and their reign of terror was finally over. Back inside, Officer Johnson approached Sarah. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for helping my brother and for helping all of us stand up to them." Sarah nodded, looking at the crowd outside. Store owners were hugging each other, some crying with relief. The neighborhood would sleep peacefully tonight for the first time in years. "The law applies to everyone," she said, "even those who wear badges, especially those who wear badges." The county courthouse buzzed with activity as the trial of officers Danvers and Reynolds began. News reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing as Inspector Sarah Chen walked into the building. Behind her came a line of witnesses, store owners, fellow officers, and community members, all ready to tell their stories. Inside the courtroom, Danvers and Reynolds sat in their gray prison uniforms, looking nothing like the confident officers they once were. Their expensive lawyer, Mr. Harrison, shuffled through papers nervously. The evidence against his clients was overwhelming. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Maria Thompson entered. The judge, known for her strict handling of police corruption cases, looked at the two former officers with stern eyes. District Attorney Robert Martinez opened the case. "Your Honor, what we will show today is not just about two corrupt cops. This is about a criminal enterprise that operated under the protection of police badges." The first witness was Marcus Torres. He walked to the stand, his head held high. The recording from his shop played clearly through the courtroom speakers. People gasped as they heard the threats and intimidation in the officers' voices. "And what happened after you refused to pay them?" the DA asked Marcus. "They drove by my shop multiple times that night," Marcus testified. "They wanted to scare me, but I knew someone had to stand up to them." Mrs. Kim from the Asian market testified next. She brought her notebook showing every payment she had made. $300 every month, she said, her voice shaking but strong. "They said it was for protection, but they were the ones we needed protection from." Joe from the diner showed years of security camera footage. The videos clearly showed the officers collecting money, threatening store owners, and meeting with drug dealers. Officer Johnson testified about the evidence room. They made me help them cover up their crimes, he admitted. They threatened my family. I was too scared to say no. Tommy Miller, the drug dealer, appeared in his orange prison uniform. They controlled all the drug trade in their area, he explained. They took seized drugs from the evidence room and sold them back to us. Anyone who didn't play by their rules got arrested or worse. The bank records showed the truth about their money. The prosecutor displayed their account statements on a large screen. Officer Danvers deposited $312,000 in cash over 3 years, he explained. Officer Reynolds deposited $298,000. Their combined police salary for those years was only $180,000. During a break, Sarah watched Danvers and Reynolds talking urgently with their lawyer. She could see the fear in their eyes now, the same fear they had put in so many others. When the trial resumed, Mr. Harrison announced that Reynolds wanted to make a deal. He would testify against Danvers in exchange for a lighter sentence. Danvers jumped up angrily. "You traitor," he shouted as officers pulled him back. "After everything we did together." Reynolds took the stand and told everything. He explained their whole system, how they chose their targets, how they kept other officers quiet, how they moved drugs and money. With each word, Danvers seemed to sink lower in his chair. The jury took only 2 hours to reach their verdict. The courtroom was packed as everyone returned to hear it. On the charges of corruption, extortion, drug trafficking, evidence tampering, and abuse of power, we find both defendants guilty, the jury foreman announced. Judge Thompson looked at the former officers. "You were given badges to protect people. Instead, you used them to terrorize a community. You betrayed everything those badges stand for." She sentenced Danvers to 20 years in prison. Reynolds got 12 years for cooperating. Both would never work in law enforcement again. As they were led away in handcuffs, Sarah noticed something different about the community members in the courtroom. They weren't afraid anymore. They stood tall, watching their former tormentors being taken to prison. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Sarah. "This case sends a clear message," she told them. "No one is above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it." Marcus Torres stood nearby with other store owners. They were already planning a community celebration. Their neighborhood would never be the same, it would be better. Justice was served today, Sarah thought, watching the prison van drive away with Danvers and Reynolds inside. The biggest bullies in the 43rd Precinct had finally been humbled. Life in Blackwater State Prison was nothing like patrolling the streets of the 43rd Precinct. Michael Danvers sat in his small cell, staring at the gray walls that had become his new home. His blue uniform was replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his badge and gun long gone. 6 months had passed since the trial. The once powerful officer now spent his days in protective custody, separated from other inmates. Being a corrupt cop in prison was dangerous. Everyone knew what happened to police officers behind bars. In another wing of the prison, Steve Reynolds adjusted to his own new reality. His cooperation had earned him a lighter sentence, but it had also earned him Danvers' hatred. Every time they passed each other during supervised activities, Danvers' eyes burned with rage. One morning, Danvers received his first visitor, his teenage daughter, Emily. She sat across from him in the visiting room, a thick glass window between them. Her eyes were filled with disappointment. "Why did you do it, Dad?" she asked, holding back tears. "My friends at school show me news articles about what you did. How am I supposed to explain this?" Danvers had no answer. For the first time, he saw his actions through his daughter's eyes. The shame felt worse than any prison sentence. Meanwhile, Reynolds started writing letters, lots of them. He wrote to every person they had wronged, attempting to apologize. Most letters went unanswered, but a few people wrote back. Mrs. Kim's response was simple: "I forgive you, but I will never forget." Inspector Sarah Chen received updates about both former officers. She learned that Danvers spent most of his time alone, refusing to participate in prison programs. Reynolds, on the other hand, had joined a prison education program and was counseling other inmates. Back in their old neighborhood, things had changed dramatically. The 43rd Precinct had new leadership, and honest police work was rebuilding trust with the community. Store owners no longer jumped when police cars drove by. One day, a TV news crew came to the prison to interview Danvers for a documentary about police corruption. He agreed, thinking he could justify his actions. Instead, they showed him recent footage of his old patrol area. He watched as Marcus Torres cut a ribbon at his expanded electronics shop. Mrs. Kim's daughter was now running a successful chain of markets. Joe's diner was full of happy customers, including police officers who paid for their own meals. "How does it feel to see your former territory thriving without your protection?" the interviewer asked. Danvers couldn't answer. He asked to end the interview and returned to his cell, the images of success without corruption burning in his mind. Reynolds watched the same documentary in the prison library. When they showed Tommy Miller, now released and running a legitimate business, Reynolds broke down crying. The other inmates watched uncomfortably as their former tormentor finally showed real remorse. During their mandatory counseling sessions, both men faced hard truths. Reynolds admitted he joined the corruption gradually, telling himself it wasn't really hurting anyone. Danvers still struggled to accept responsibility, blaming everyone but himself. 1 year into their sentences, they received news from outside. The police department had started using their case to train new officers about corruption. Their story was now a cautionary tale, teaching future police officers about the consequences of betraying their badge. Emily visited Danvers less frequently now. Her last visit was different. She was wearing a police cadet uniform. "I'm joining the force," she told him, "to help fix what you broke, to show people that not all cops are like you were." Reynolds received a letter from Officer Johnson, whose brother was doing well in rehab. "Your threats once controlled my life," Johnson wrote. "Now they remind me to always do what's right, no matter how hard it seems." In their separate cells at night, both men faced their own demons. Danvers looked at family photos, wondering how he had thrown everything away for money and power. Reynolds wrote in his journal, documenting his journey from corruption to redemption. The prison walls were their new reality, a daily reminder that no one was above the law. Their badges, once symbols of their power, had become symbols of their shame. In the end, the biggest punishment wasn't the prison sentence. It was living with the knowledge of how many lives they had hurt, including their own. The 43rd precinct looked different now. Fresh paint covered the walls, and new faces filled the halls. Inspector Sarah Chen, now Captain Chen, sat in her office reviewing the changes of the past 5 years since the arrest of Danvers and Reynolds. On her wall hung a framed newspaper article, "From Corruption to Community, How One Neighborhood Transformed." Below it was a group photo of all the business owners who had helped bring down the corrupt officers. Marcus Torres stood in the center, his electronics shop now a successful chain with 3 locations. Sarah's phone rang. It was the prison warden. Steve Reynolds was being released today, after serving 5 years of his 12-year sentence. His good behavior and continued cooperation with ongoing corruption investigations had earned him early release. "He's a changed man," the warden said. "Been teaching other inmates to read, helping with anti-corruption programs." Even Danvers' daughter visited him to learn the full truth about what happened. Outside the precinct, the neighborhood had transformed. The streets that were once controlled by fear now buzzed with life. Mrs. Kim's daughter had opened a community center in their old store location. Joe's Diner became a meeting place where police officers and residents came together for monthly community meetings. That afternoon, Sarah visited the new police academy. Emily Danvers, now Officer Emily Roberts, she had changed her last name, was teaching a special class about police ethics. She used her father's story to show new recruits how corruption destroys lives. "My father will be in prison for 15 more years," Emily told her students. "But his real punishment is knowing that he betrayed everything this badge stands for." At the community center, Marcus Torres ran a program helping small business owners stand up to intimidation. His recording device was displayed in a small case, a reminder of how one person's courage could change everything. "5 years ago, we were all afraid," Marcus told a group of new shop owners. "Now we work together with the police to keep our neighborhoods safe. Real safety, not the kind you have to pay for." Officer Johnson, promoted to sergeant, led the precinct's new anti-corruption unit. His office wall featured a quote, "Courage is contagious." Below it hung photos of every officer who had helped expose corruption in other precincts, inspired by what happened in the 43rd. That evening, Reynolds stepped out of prison, carrying only a small bag of belongings. Unlike Danvers, who still maintained his innocence, Reynolds had used his time to reflect and change. He planned to work with police departments, sharing his story to prevent others from following his path. Sarah met him outside the prison gates. "The neighborhood you once terrorized is having a celebration today," she told him. "They're marking 5 years of freedom from corruption. Would you like to see what real community protection looks like?" Reynolds nodded quietly. As they drove through the old patrol area, he barely recognized it. New businesses had opened. Children played freely in the streets. Police officers walked their beats, chatting with residents and shop owners. They stopped at Joe's Diner. Inside, the community was gathered for their monthly meeting. When Reynolds walked in, the room fell silent. He stood nervously, facing the people he had once terrorized. "I can never undo what I did," he said, his voice shaking. "But I can spend the rest of my life showing others where that path leads. Thank you for showing me what real police work should be." Mrs. Kim's daughter stood up first. "We celebrate today not just because 2 corrupt officers went to prison," she said. "We celebrate because we learned to stand together. Your story helped other communities find their courage." Back at the precinct, Sarah looked at a new batch of officer applications. Trust in the police had grown so much that local young people wanted to join the force. The 43rd Precinct, once known for corruption, had become a model for police community relations. As the sun set over the neighborhood, shop owners closed their stores without fear. Police officers ended their shifts proud of their honest work, and somewhere in his prison cell, Michael Danvers received a letter from his daughter, telling him about the positive changes his negative example had inspired. The story of 2 corrupt cops had become more than a cautionary tale. It had become a lesson in courage, community, and the power of standing up for what's right.